The night reeked of copper and rain, a sour blend that clung to the skin long after the violence ended. In the fractured silence that followed, the fugitive's breath became the only rhythm, ragged, shallow, punctuated by the distant drip of water fattening in unseen cracks. The city beyond was mute, its lights blurred by sheets of rain, its windows staring down with the cold indifference of 1,000 unblinking eyes. He ran, feet slipping on wet stone, the alleyways warping into tunnels that funneled the panic inward. Every shadow threatened to coalesce into pursuers, men with badges, faces masked by rage or fear, or worse yet, the faceless shapes that haunted the edge of memory, sharper than any blade. Blood, the memory of it, throbbed between his fingers. It wasn't all his. He clung to the notion that not every stain on his shirt or hands belonged to him, but the difference was academic now. The streets were slick with guilt, and each step left a crimson echo in his mind. He dared not look back. Behind him was a crime, a moment of blinding violence, a mistake or a choice that could never be unwound. Ahead, the city sprawled and buckled, its familiar geometry yielding to the surreal as fear gnawed at the edges of reason. He pressed himself against a rusted door, heart jackhammering. Somewhere a siren wailed, distant but inevitable, as if the city itself was mourning. He fumbled with trembling hands at his pockets, desperate for something, anything to anchor him. Instead, his fingers closed around a key, impossibly cold, its weight sinking through his palm as though it meant to burrow inside. It was not his. He could not recall picking it up. Its surface was engraved with symbols that writhed when looked at directly, lines that threatened to rearrange the world in their wake. Even in the dimness, it gleamed with a wet sheen, as if it had just been pulled from a wound in the earth. He stared at the key, unable to shake the certainty that it had been waiting for him. The city's noise seemed to coil around it, thinning, then thickening, a membrane between him and whatever waited on the other side. The door before him groaned with age, paint peeling in leprous strips, hinges swollen with the memory of 1,000 storms. He hesitated, listening for footsteps, chasing, hunting, always closing in. The key pulled at his hand, an invitation, or a dare, promising shelter or something far crueler. With a breath that tasted of iron and old fear, he slid the key into the lock. The mechanism shuddered, resisting, then yielded with a click that was too loud, too final. The city's lights flickered, as though a current had been cut. He turned the key further, feeling the world tilt, the floor slanting beneath his feet. The door swung open, not into a room, but into a corridor that was impossibly long, its walls lined with mirrors stained and spider-webbed with cracks. The air beyond was colder, thick with the scent of rot and something older than memory. For a moment, he glanced over his shoulder, half hoping for pursuit, half dreading it. But the alley was empty, the rain muting everything into a dull hush. He stepped inside, the door closing behind with a sound that felt like a verdict. The mirrors reflected not just his face, but dozens, hundreds of selves, each one flickering, their eyes dark and hollow. The passage stretched on, vanishing into darkness, the only certainty the key's weight in his hand and the knowledge that leaving was no longer an option. He moved forward, the echo of his steps multiplying in the silent hall. Each reflection seemed to lean closer, lips parting in silent accusation or whispered warning. The further he walked, the less his surroundings resembled the world he knew. Corners twisted, lights pulsed in unnatural rhythms, and time itself seemed to unravel, each second pulling him deeper into a labyrinth shaped by regret and memory. He knew even then that this was a journey without a map, that every door he opened would lead him further from the life he'd known and closer to something vast, indifferent, and hungry. The key's chill seeped into his bones, a reminder that in some places, escape is just another form of captivity. A hush, thick and oppressive, settled over the fugitive as he pressed deeper into the labyrinthine passage. The air here was heavy with anticipation, as if the walls themselves strained to catch every ragged breath, every faltering step. With each stride, the corridor's geometry warped. Angles skewed, doors bulged like swollen veins, and the ceiling heaved in sync with some distant, unseen pulse. What had once seemed a straightforward escape now twisted into an interrogation of perception itself. The pale light that seeped from unseen cracks licked across the floor, painting grotesque shadows that sprawled and slithered, never quite following the logic expected of ordinary illumination. Now imagine the sensation of being watched, but not by eyes in the conventional sense. Instead, the fugitive sensed a presence within the very architecture, a sentience that regarded him with hunger and amusement. Every so often, the walls would quiver, releasing a sound halfway between a sigh and a shudder. In this distorted sanctuary, silence sharpened into a threat. The usual comfort of solitude curdled into hostility. He realized that here, the line separating the observer from the observed melted away, leaving him exposed not only to whatever haunted these corridors, but also to himself. Every footstep became a confession, every breath an admission of guilt or fear. Pushing forward, he discovered that the key, once merely an object, had become an agent of change. Its chill was no longer physical but psychological, seeping into his thoughts and distorting them. Ideas that once felt certain, memories, identities, intentions fractured under its influence. Faces of people he had known flickered through his mind, but their features blurred and shifted. Voices mangled into murmurs he could almost, but not quite, decipher. As he passed by a door marked only with a smear of rust, a sudden cacophony of whispers erupted behind it as though the wood barely contained 100 secrets clamoring to be heard. He froze, knuckles whitening around the key, the urge to flee battling with the compulsion to listen. Furthermore, the corridor was not static. With each turn, the very rules of space and time buckled. Clocks embedded into the walls ticked in, reverse, their hands jerking in spasms rather than smooth circles. When he glanced at his own reflection in a warped pane of glass, he found his mouth moving, shaping words he did not say. His shadow broke away from his feet, crawling across the tiles and disappearing into a crack. Every so often, doors would shudder on their hinges, as if something on the other side was trying to claw its way through. The fugitive gritted his teeth, forcing himself to ignore the urge to look back, to question which version of himself walked these halls. Another crucial layer unfolded as he encountered other denizens of this place. Not people, strictly speaking, but impressions, echoes of souls who had passed through before. A woman in tattered velvet appeared at the far end of a cross corridor, her face veiled in shadow. She regarded him with a tilt of her head, hands clasped as if in prayer, but her eyes glinted like shards of obsidian. When she spoke, it was with a voice borrowed from his own memories, delivering warnings laced with riddles. "Every escape is a return," she whispered, then vanished as abruptly as she'd appeared, her footsteps fading into a hush that pressed against his eardrums. Sorry. This juncture, consider the psychological toll exacted when every certainty is upended, when even the sanctuary of one's mind becomes a battlefield. The fugitive's sense of self, once tenuous but intact, now splintered as the boundaries between reality and hallucination blurred. Each new corridor presented not hope, but a fresh test of resilience. The architecture itself seemed to feed on his indecision, swelling with every moment of hesitation, tightening with each flicker of doubt. The deeper he ventured, the clearer it became that the true trial was not escape, but endurance, a test of how long a soul could persist when beset by horrors that made even memory suspect. Light, when it appeared, didn't behave as it should. A phosphorescent blue glow seeped from beneath the skirting boards, pulsing in time with an irregular, arrhythmic beat. This was not illumination for comfort or clarity. Instead, it sculpted shapes from the darkness, elongated limbs, faces half emerging from the walls, mouths agape but silent. Each pulse sharpened the angles of the corridor, imbuing the air with a brittle tension, as if the structure braced for a storm that never quite arrived. The fugitive reached a fork where the corridor split abruptly, one side descending into a spiral staircase that groaned under its own weight, the other veering into a chamber smothered in velvet drapes. Here, the very act of choosing a path felt like tearing fabric with bare hands. Each option threatened to unravel some critical thread holding him together. Now, reflect on the peculiar sensation of being shadowed by memories that no longer obey the boundaries of past and present. In the velvet room, the fugitive's vision swam with flickering impressions. A childhood bedroom, the sharp scent of antiseptic from a hospital corridor, the echoing clatter of a gavel in a courtroom. These were not memories summoned by nostalgia. They were intrusions, pushed to the surface by something predatory and unseen. Every object in the chamber seemed to vibrate with the residue of moments he'd tried to forget. A cracked toy soldier, a stained manila envelope, a broken wristwatch. Ticking backward, the air pressed in, thick with the thread of recollection, and he realized that here, forgetting was not only impossible, but dangerous. The room forced him to confront not only what he'd done, but all the versions of himself who might have chosen differently. Moving on, the fugitive's footsteps carried him into a hallway lined with doors that bore no locks, yet refused to yield. Each one shimmered with a film of condensation, as if exhaling a feverish breath. Rather than invite exploration, these doors radiated a warning. The secrets behind them were not meant to be known. A sudden draft carried the distant sound of laughter, jarring, discordant, not quite human. It was the laughter of someone who knew every lie he'd ever told, every kindness feigned, every cruelty justified. That sound wormed its way into the fugitive's mind, leaving behind a residue of shame that he could neither swallow nor spit out. In stark contrast with the suffocating chambers, a side corridor revealed a window, grimy, rimed with frost, yet through it he glimpsed a landscape, wholly alien. Ashen fields stretched beneath a sky shredded by black lightning, and in the distance, spires twisted skyward, their surfaces crawling with what looked like living shadows. No comfort or hope lay beyond this barrier, only a panorama of desolation, as if the outside world had been remade in the image of his most private terrors. The fugitive recoiled, understanding that this place neither responded to his will nor cared for his suffering. It was a reflection, not a prison, and every detail was drawn from the marrow of his own worst imaginings. Turning away, he stumbled into a gallery of portraits. Each canvas depicted a figure with his own features, but none wore the same expression. Fury, grief, ecstasy, resignation, each self-portrait captured a facet he recognized and loathed. Some figures reached toward him, their painted hands breaking the boundaries of the frame, while others seemed to wither under his gaze, their colors bleeding into the canvas. Now, consider how the simple act of seeing oneself refracted in so many ways can become an agony all its own. The gallery was not meant to inspire self-understanding, but to torment him with the knowledge that every decision he'd made had spawned a shadow, each one waiting for its chance to take center stage. He pressed onward, the key in his palm growing colder, heavier, as if feeding on his mounting dread. The architecture bent once more, and the air itself began to taste of rust and old paper. Voices whispered from the pipes overhead, reciting fragments of conversations he could not place, yet somehow knew by heart. The fugitive squeezed his eyes, shut, but the voices multiplied, rising in a chorus of accusation and regret. With each step, he felt himself dissolving, not into the darkness, but into the multitude of selves that hunted him from within. The passage narrowed, pressing inward, with a claustrophobic insistence that refused to allow even the comfort of a steady breath. Here, the fugitive's steps faltered as the floor itself began to shift beneath him, rippling as though alive. The boundaries of the corridor blurred in a haze of flickering lights and undulating shadows, and the sense of direction, up, down, forward, dissolved into a swirling vertigo. In this space, time fractured, and the very concept of sequence became slippery. Moments bled into each other, present and future inseparable. So each action felt simultaneously inevitable and impossible to avoid. This was a crucible where moral certainty crumbled. Every decision, no matter how small, seemed to echo in the darkness, magnified and distorted until it became monstrous. As he pressed onward, The walls began to display shifting images, brief flashes of events that never quite happened but felt agonizingly familiar. A hand reaching out for help, then retracting at the last moment. A whispered apology left unsaid. Each vignette played out in silence, yet the emotional undertow was suffocating. These were not memories but possibilities, branching paths that might have led to salvation or damnation. The fugitive found himself paralyzed by the weight of these lost chances, each one a silent accusation that gnawed at his resolve. The corridor became a stage for his failures, a relentless parade of what-ifs and if-onlys that forced him to confront the consequences of his own indecision. Pushing through this torment, he encountered a series of alcoves, each housing a figure shrouded in tattered fabric. These were not people, but effigies crafted from scraps of clothing, broken watches, torn letters, artifacts of lives left behind. Their faces were hidden, but their hands were exposed, some reaching, some clenched in fists, some frozen in gestures of supplication or accusation. The fugitive could not help but wonder if these effigies were warnings or invitations. The urge to interact with them warred with a deep instinct to flee, a primal fear that touching one might awaken something long dormant or unleash a consequence too dreadful to imagine. This uncertainty bred a new dimension of terror, not just the fear of what lurked ahead, but the horror of what might be unleashed by a single, irrevocable choice. Further complicating matters, the environment responded to his hesitation. Whenever he lingered, debating which path to follow or whether to confront the effigies, the corridor pulsed with a low, resonant hum. The air thickened, pressing on his chest, making each breath a conscious effort. In contrast, decisive movement seemed to thin the atmosphere, offering brief respite but propelling him into increasingly complex and dangerous configurations of space and symbolism. This dynamic turned every moment into a test of willpower, forcing the fugitive to weigh the risks of action against the perils of inaction. The labyrinth was not just a physical challenge but a moral gauntlet, demanding that he reckon with the cost of choice itself. Now, picture a moment when the fugitive stumbled upon a door set into the floor, its surface slick with condensation and etched with unfamiliar runes. Unlike the others, this portal pulsed with a sickly green light, inviting him to descend into depths he could not see. The temptation to open it warred with the certainty that doing so would mean abandoning any pretense of control. This was the essence of the test: to confront the unknown not as an abstract threat, but as a living force tailored to exploit every fragment of doubt and regret. The labyrinth punished passivity as ruthlessly as recklessness, and the fugitive recognized, perhaps too late, that survival in this place demanded not just courage, but a willingness to embrace the consequences of one's own flawed humanity. Reflecting on this journey so far, one senses the way tension coils tighter with each step. The fugitive's ordeal unfolding not as a linear passage, but as a spiral, drawing in on itself, ever more constricted. What has transpired is not simply a flight nor a pursuit, but a transformation. A slow, inexorable unraveling where the boundaries between the pursuer and the pursued, the innocent and the guilty, dissolve like mist against the dawn. The world itself has become a living organism, its sinews stretching and contracting in response to every flicker of doubt or yearning for redemption. No longer is there the illusion of a single path or an unbroken line from cause to consequence. Instead, the corridors bleed possibility, each juncture a riddle posed not in words but in the shifting architecture of dread and memory. In light of these insights, the path forward becomes more than a matter of mere escape. The fugitive's movement, once a desperate lunge for freedom, reconfigures into a negotiation with forces that are at once external and deeply internal. The key, once cold and inert, pulses now with accumulated meaning, its heft an index of choices made and doors opened, each one a threshold to a deeper layer of self-recognition. The labyrinth is no longer just a place of walls and doors, but a crucible where identity itself is melted down and recast. The echoes of former selves, reverberating in every unseen corner. As the fugitive's form blurs at the edges, the sense of self that once anchored him grows porous, admitting both terror and the possibility of a new, if unsettling, awareness. Drawing these strands together, We see the interplay of guilt and yearning, horror and hope, rendered not just as private anguish, but as the architecture of the world itself. The environment, so responsive to the fugitive's internal tremors, has become a living testament to the notion that reality offers no refuge from what we carry within. The very air seems to vibrate with anticipation, as if the next decision, whatever it may be, will not merely shape the outcome, but collapse the distance between the self and its shadows. In this way, the journey ceases to be about running from a past or seeking a future, and becomes instead an encounter with the raw, unvarnished present, a moment suspended between terror and revelation. As we pivot towards the final reflection, imagine the fugitive's senses sharpening, every detail suffused with a portentous clarity. The labyrinth, once a maze of brute confusion, now hums with a logic that is both alien and intimately familiar, its corridors offering not escape, but confrontation. The air is charged with the knowledge that each door opened is not merely a passage but a reckoning. Each reflection glimpsed a negotiation with the fragments of a battered soul. The fugitive, reshaped by ordeal and exposure, stands poised on the threshold of something final. The boundaries between self and world, memory and reality, trembling with the promise or the threat of dissolution. In the gathering hush before, the storm's return, a kind of stillness settles, heavy and electric. The fugitive's breath mingles with the pulse of the labyrinth, each inhalation a tacit agreement to continue, to risk whatever remains in the hope of something more than repetition. It is in this liminal hush, suspended between what has been endured and what waits beyond the next door, that anticipation sharpens to a knife's edge. The sense of the inevitable draws closer, not as a resolution, but as a deepening of the very questions that set this journey in motion. Now, as the storm presses in and the walls begin to tremble, all that remains is the choice to step forward, and the knowledge that every step is both an ending and a beginning, folding endlessly into the dark. In the end, the labyrinth was never truly a place, but a condition, a state of being in which every corridor turned back on itself, and every door, no matter how heavy or ornate, opened only onto another aspect of the same inescapable interior. The fugitive, battered by the relentless procession of mirrors and masks, came to sense that the true prison was not forged of stone or iron, but of memory and its refusal to grant absolution. The key, cold as regret, had promised passage, but its gift was a kind of clarity stripped of comfort. Within these shifting realities, it became clear that freedom was not something to be found on the other side of a threshold. It was the name given to the fleeting hope that this time, the next door, might lead outward instead of further in. Yet as the storm's thunder fractured the world's edges and the walls trembled with the approach of his darker selves, the fugitive understood that each version of himself, every cruel act, every mercy withheld, every desperate longing, waited not as adversaries, but as fragments demanding witness. The horror was not in their hunger, but in their familiarity. To be hunted by one's own shadow is to know that the most persistent pursuit comes from within, and that the wounds we flee are never far behind. The key was never an instrument of escape. It was a summons to face what had been locked away, a demand for reckoning that could not be bargained down with denial or hope. In that final, unending moment, as his scream folded endlessly into the void and reality splintered beyond recognition, the fugitive realized that the search for redemption, for escape, for peace, was itself a kind of haunting. The labyrinth did not punish or absolve, it merely revealed. In its cold, indifferent geometry, it offered no answers, only the infinite echo of choices made and unmade, the staggering weight of a life measured not by what was endured, but by what was never confronted. To look into the fractured mirrors was to see not a monster but a human being, hopelessly divided, yearning for coherence, and condemned to wander the corridors of conscience as long as breath or memory endured. What lingers is this: the darkness. That unsettles us most is not the threat outside, but the one that grows in the silent chambers of our own hearts. The doors we open in fear or longing are seldom final. Each threshold asks us to reckon with who we have been and who we might become. The true terror is not in being trapped, but in the knowledge that we hold the key, and that every act, every denial, every truth left unspoken is another turn in the lock. If there is any solace or warning to be drawn from this descent, it is that the labyrinth is never truly left behind. It is carried quietly, beneath the skin, in the hush between heartbeats and the uneasy silence after the storm. The next time you reach for a door in darkness, whether in the world or in your own mind, pause and listen for the echo of footsteps behind you. The true practice begins now, to face the shifting corridors and open each door with eyes unflinching, knowing that the only way forward is through the shadows we dare to name our own.